It's going round and round.
Can you see that? Okay. Hello. I don't know whether you can see me because we can't see you. In case you're on your gazillionth Zoom call and can't remember which webinar you're attending, this is the Society of Authors Home Festival. Welcome. This event is part of our autumn-winter season. It is a 9-week program of online events which runs into the 10th of December. And today we will be looking into our crystal balls. Our panel is called Imagining 2021, the future for writers and creators. Hashtag SOA at home. I am a children's author. My name is Candy Gourlay, and I'm going to be your host. You can tag me on Twitter at Candy Gourlay. Before we get on with it, here's some stuff that you need to know. If you have any streaming issues, don't panic. Just press the reconnect button at the top of the screen. The reconnect button is the triangle with the exclamation point. Now, if you have a question or a comment, please use the chat box. Click on the speech bubble icon on the right and see what everybody's saying. Everyone seems to be saying hello, hello from Amsterdam or Herefordshire, Weymouth. Lots of people are saying hello. There are quite a lot of people today, so it might be that I will struggle to find your questions, but we will do our best. In the final 20 or 25 minutes of this session, we will try to go into this chat box to hopefully respond to some of your questions and comments. And we have a bookshop. Thank you to Blackwell's for handling sales. My lovely friend, Sophia Jackson, will be posting useful links in the chat box. And Sophia, you can post that link to Blackwell's right now. Christmas is coming, everyone, so please buy books, especially mine, and maybe also the books of my guests. It's all for a good cause. A percentage will go towards the Authors Contingency Fund to help authors in financial need during this pandemic. If you find you really don't want to buy books, that's okay. Maybe you'd like to just donate. A minimum donation of £5 would be nice. Anyway, you're stuck at home. You can pretend you're working in Starbucks and you're just buying a coffee with a bonus that you're helping out your colleagues. Sophia there? I can't see you, Sophia, but hopefully we'll post all those links. Sophia, please post the donation link in the chat box. So look out for the donation link and the bookshop link. And now may I introduce you to our panelists. Okay. It's very disconcerting because we can't see the audience. We can see each other, but I'm not sure that we're online at all. I'm just going to assume that we are. So Sharmaine Lovegrove was a bookseller before she became a publisher of Hachette UK's inclusive imprint Dialogue Books, named after her famous bookshop in Berlin. Sharmaine, when the pandemic started, everyone was scared. And some of us feared that this was the end of the book industry. But lo and behold, at the end of the first lockdown, we discovered that people were reading 40% more. And the David Williamses of the publishing world were selling well. What did you most fear for the book industry when the first lockdown began? And did it turn out to be true?
Hi, good evening. Yeah, I think that's really so much Netflix that you can watch. And so what else are you going to do than read? And in our sort of very busy lives pre-lockdown, where people are commuting and going to have a myriad of cultural activities from theatres, remember theatres, and exhibitions and cinema, remember cinemas, then, books have taken centre stage. And I think one of the crucial issues around the publishing industry is that this lack of understanding that literature and books are actually a cornerstone of our cultural society. And the fact that people were afraid by how people were going to possibly read shows how disconnected the publishing industry at large is from readers. So no, I didn't have any fears, but I was really excited about the innovation. And with Dialogue, my imprint, then we came up with the Dialogue Book Lounge, where for 10 weeks, I interviewed my authors, exclusive book launch in London. We actually had 195 people. So to me, this whole thing.
I'm a children's author, and what happened with us was we had all of our lives are all about school visits, and what happened was all that disappeared. And so we were kind of in a state of incredible fear, but it all kind of got sorted out a little bit as we went along. Now, Alan Dein, Alan.
Hello.
Program, Don't Log Off. You've become known for talking to people. No, not just talking, listening. And throughout this pandemic.
I'm really sorry, but I think everyone's saying that there's an issue. We can't hear. So
we can hear somebody. And we need
No, but I think the chat is saying that it's freezing all the time for the people following. I mean, the AGM for the same number of people worked on Zoom. I mean, Candy, you were there. I wonder if there's a possibility.
Something, but it's gone quiet now. I feel like I can hear somebody. There's a very noisy something going on in another place, but it's gone quiet now. Shall we try? Shall we keep going?
Yeah, I can hear the sound. There's some strange sound effects.
Yes.
Going on. I don't know what that is. That's not from us.
It's not from us.
It's from somewhere else. So that's just a digital blur somewhere along the line. People are saying it's free.
Yeah, people are asking if we can swap, because I think they can't hear anything.
Okay, we could swap to Zoom.
We need Sophia to decide.
This isn't working.
Yeah. Definitely not working.
Okay, if we're going to swap, someone has to post a link to the Zoom.
What we can do is, if those of us who are not talking can go on silent.
Yeah, good idea.
So sorry, everybody. It sounds like there is a dinosaur, an invisible dinosaur in the room, and it's very hard to continue.
Yeah, it's difficult to identify where it's coming from.
Yes, and once in a while it goes quiet.
It's gone now.
Yes, so...
Yeah, it seems okay now.
Okay, shall we have a go? And Sophia Jackson, if you can hear us, can you have a backup plan in case the dinosaur starts again? Okay, right. I'll read my script again. Alan Dein is an oral historian and broadcaster. Now, Alan has a show called Don't Log Off on Radio 4. And you've become known for talking to people, not just talking, but listening. And throughout this pandemic on your program, you've been holding conversations with people from all over the world about their experiences. What have they been telling you?
Good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. Firstly, thanks for the introduction. And Don't Log Off is a series that's been running for nearly 8 or 9 years now on Radio 4 and on the World Service. It's and the idea is it began as a random series of conversations. I spoke to people around the world, just chatting about what's going on in their lives. Of course, this year was very specific. It was their lives plus COVID, and of course, how they are interacting with the pandemic. And of course, a lot of people are talking about very difficult, complex issues they've had, whether it's just negotiating, traveling back to their home country if they're living in another country. Some people are incredibly isolated. For example, I've got a regular Ismail in Nigeria who's in Benin, who has basically been living inside a mosque for 8 months. He's got nowhere else to live. He can't get back to his home in Lagos. And so he's been living there, and he's been reading all the time. He's got nothing else but a few books, and he's been rereading those books. I've actually been sending him books just to keep him going. But what I have noticed, and this is quite intriguing because the year has gone kind of quickly. We're now in November. My conversations with people relating to the pandemic started in March, and I've been speaking to people, communicating to them pretty much all year. And I've noticed that people really have found ways of keeping going. And the concept of hope is a big one. And people are incredibly resourceful. and of course in relationship to reading, and the significance of reading is important, is that as someone has said previously, you know, obviously there is something about your bookshelves where you don't actually return to books that are the books you bought recently, but you're looking at the bookshelves. And most of us who have a reasonably stocked bookshelves have only read 10% of them. I don't even think I've read 10% of the books I own. And a lot of the things I'm doing is actually looking at books that I've never actually read, I've never had a chance to read or even skim through. And it is interesting, you know, and I think it's a part of a bigger question you have about later on when you're going to discuss about how do we get away from those hugely successful authors and try and get into other authors, and how do other people manage to become read. And I think it's most probably one of the big roles we all have is discovery, and knowing that and that a lot of people, I think at this point in time, are feeling a little bit more confident to discover, because they've got more time on their hands to discover. And I think that is an important thing. And one of the things we talk about hope is that people are feeling that even though this is such a cruddy, rubbish year, there is possibly a lot of things that we're going to take from this and will be very valuable for us all in the years to come. And it is, people have talked about recalibrating, rethinking, connecting with nature, a lot of these kind of issues, and plus being inspired by some of the bigger political stories around the world. So I'd like to think, just to answer your question and not to monologue and take up too much more time, is that I'd like to think that hope is the biggie for 2021.
Oh my God, hope, yes. I mean, I have to say the news of the vaccine has really changed my feelings about this lockdown. You know, the first time we went on lockdown, we didn't know what was going to happen next. And now we've got like a goal. We've got like the possibility of freedom on the next year. Let me introduce you to Isobel. Isobel Dixon is a poet who also happens to be MD of Blake Friedman Literary Agency. Isobel, I've heard agents say that though some launches were postponed and the big book fairs were canceled or went online, the deal making did not stop. Basically, agents have been open for business. Would you say, despite the dearth of long lunches and drinks parties, that the pandemic has been good for agents?
I think the pandemic has shown up all kinds of weak spots, flaws in the industry, places that needed to be improved, including online selling by various chains, how we speak direct to the readers and consumers out there, how publishers reach their readers. Everyone has had to think on their feet, and agents are we're by nature very ambidextrous. We have to juggle lots of things. So I think we've been juggling just a little bit faster across the client list. Some of our clients have been writing faster, but not all. So there's been more to handle, more to edit before you send it out. But on the other areas, some things have moved slower. Not everyone has had the same pandemic. You know, for some people, it's been incredibly difficult with childcare issues, caring responsibilities, anxiety. And we're still in the middle of that. And I think going to see the long tail of that all the way through next year. So along with hope, I think care and consideration is going to be part of the package for us. And though we've seen this adaptation and we have been doing those deals, as we've rightly observed, some of this is a bit of a winner-takes-all scenario where the big brand authors who've been able to be sold through the supermarkets, which have stayed open throughout, or the big commercial names selling to Amazon have been able to be sold throughout. We do have concerns for the authors that are more challenging, perhaps. I held back on sending out some literary books until after the bookstores opened. We were selling non-fiction and commercial projects all the way through, but things that needed more care and where editors needed more time and space to consider, I held those back until there was a bit more space in the in the environment. And I guess in terms of what I think going forward with the deals is that you don't want people to become less adventurous, because it's already in many ways, especially in the corporate side, a risk-averse industry. And we're trying to sell the broadest, most diverse range of voices. And while people have been very adaptable and people are quite excitable, and we've seen a great surge in people being more interested in writers of colour and voices from elsewhere, what you don't want is another thing that people find easy to do is to lapse back into complacency. Because this is going to take all of the exciting changes we've seen, the new adaptation, is going to take continued effort, real application, and stamina. So maybe that's another word for 2021 is stamina.
Stamina. We all need stamina. I can hear the dinosaur going a little bit, but I think I can continue. Okay. Philip Jones. Philip knows everything about our industry because he happens to be the editor of the Bookseller. The Booksellers conferences went online, the British Book Awards went virtual, and as we speak, the Future Book Conference is in full swing. At various panels I've appeared in, I've heard of how the pandemic has grown audiences for some and lost them for others. Gosh, the dinosaur is so distracting. The pandemic has grown audiences for some and lost them for others. For example, children's authors like me lost the school visit income we depend on for our livelihoods. Philip, since you know everything, who do you think in the book industry have so far turned out to be the winners and losers of this pandemic?
Well, there's one big winner, and that's Amazon, particularly during lockdown when bookshops were closed and non-essential retail wasn't open, generally apart from supermarkets and other online players like Waterstones.com. But Amazon is the big winner, clearly, both in terms of people shifting to online purchases, but also in terms of people moving to digital content, ebooks and audiobooks. There are plenty of not losers as well. I think the big publishers have not lost as much as they feared they would do at the beginning. So I don't know whether you remember, but back in April, Bloomsbury issued a stock market statement saying that they expected print book sales to fall by 75%, and you could feel the kind of collective gasp in the book world, and everybody started sort of despairing. And as Sharmaine mentioned, really, we are kind of a bunch of Cassandras in this industry. We're constantly surprised that readers want to buy books and the readers want to read, and they often read voraciously, and they often read far more differently than the books that are supplied to them by the sort of mainstream retailers. So what happened? Bloomsbury issued its press release, 75% for the physical book sales, and then you can't say the opposite happened because book sales didn't go up by 75%, but they didn't fall either. In fact, I think when Bloomsbury did issue its financial statement later in the year, they saw print book sales rise, as well as a massive upsurge in book and digital book sales. So bigger publishers didn't lose. As you mentioned, the brand name authors didn't lose because people flocked to them during the period when you could only buy on Amazon and via supermarkets, and people flocked to the kind of the safe names and the books that were already familiar to them in the bestseller charts. Anything that was in the news sort of did well, because I think people heard an author on the radio or on TV and immediately kind of like bought it from Amazon or from Waterstones.com. So that bit of the market, in a sense, and I'm not the first to say this, the pandemic accentuated things that were already happening, which was this drift to kind of brand names, this drift to the kind of big names, this drift to safe bets that was already happening in the industry. The pandemic just kind of pushed that along a little bit further. The big losers were the people who are perhaps at the margin. So the small presses who rely on events, rely on bookshops, hand selling their books. And we saw immediately that their sales really did decline by often more than 75% because they just couldn't get enough noise, enough visibility for the books that they were publishing. And often they don't do a lot in ebook format. They don't do a lot in audiobook format because it's expensive for them. So they're really, really reliant on print book sales, and they just stopped literally overnight for some of their small presses. So that really, and we'll probably come back to talk about diversity later on in this panel, but really the sort of diversity that is already there in the book business, I think, has been really threatened by the pandemic. And that's something that we all, I think, bigger publishers, bigger authors, retailers, pundits, journalists, all need to keep an eye on, not just this year, but looking into 2021.
Thank you. Okay, now that we've painted a picture of what happened during the pandemic, it's time to invite each guest to look into his or her crystal ball. The one thing that has been made clear by the pandemic is that the world is voracious for content. The pandemic is fueling a growth in film and TV studios. Millions of pounds are being poured into building Hollywood-style studios in the UK. People are buying more books, more computer games, listening to podcasts, watching TV. But what stories do we think are being told? Alan Dein, you're in the business of listening, and as an oral historian, you actually document voices. Are you getting a sense of how people are framing this narrative? I mean, look at the Spanish flu. It came to be known as Spanish flu, even though it originated in an army base in America. How was that pandemic so quickly forgotten? How, despite all those deaths, was the Roaring Twenties so compelling that people forgot about the dead? Based on all the people you've interviewed, Alan, how do you think this story is going to be told in times to come?
It's a very interesting point and a complex one, because, of course, you know, we still remember the dead of the First World War, which was just before the pandemic, and obviously the Spanish flu. Many of us grew up wherever we grew up, and we certainly 1914 to 1918. That, you know, wherever we go around the world, we see those dates, and we see we see the memorials. We don't see the memorials to the Spanish flu, and I never even heard of it when I grew up. When I did my looked at the history books and I was at school, I don't think we even covered the Spanish flu. It sort of disappeared. Let's face it, pandemics are not fun. They're not exciting. They're not about daring do. They're horrible. And it was just lost. It was lost. And it's only taken recent years and this pandemic, 100 years on, for us to even think about it. But as far as you know, the bigger question, of course, the big problem is where we go from here, and what we are going to learn from this experience. And I think that, I think for me, listening and talking to people, and I've been fortunate to be able to speak to people around the world, because the whole point of the project that I work on is it is very much global. I'm speaking to people in lots of different countries. You know, yesterday I spoke to a midwife working in Haiti in the Caribbean, but of course she says she's not even thinking about COVID. There's 20% employment amongst those people of employment age. That is the big issue there. It's not COVID. And in some parts of the world, they're not even thinking really about the pandemic in the way we are, and we are fixating on the pandemic. So there's other issues, and that key point that was raised earlier, and I think this is so significant, is the way that things that are already have been part of our structure in society have been magnified manyfold by the pandemic. So the people who are on the top of the pile are the least likely to be affected. Those at the bottom of the pile are going to be more dramatically affected. And as far as those people, for example, who are less likely, whose books and work is less likely to be read and sold, that is going to be a struggle. Nevertheless, and one thing we learned, and I've spent 25 years working freelance predominantly for the BBC, one thing we never saw coming was the arrival of the podcast. Now, the podcast, which is, you know, obviously there is the book and audio version of it. The thing about the podcast is that, yes, it's incredibly democratic, just as the internet is democratic. But at the end of the day, who is making money out of the podcasts? How many people are earning bucks out of the podcasts? And it's very few. And the people who are the people who are backed by the big global corporations. And that is still part of the world that we're living in. So I think that The only thing we can do is for people who are thinking and trying to kind of change things, is that we can get our voices heard and obviously listen to what people are saying. And I think listening is one thing that we need to do more and more. A lot of us talk, and there's a lot of noise out there. And unfortunately, we spent a whole year living, or 4 years living, with the most noisiest president of all time. Just noise, noise, noise. But one of the things we have to do is actually kind of close the noise off and actually start thinking and listening. And so to answer the question, I think it is all about trying to hear those voices that are less likely to be presented to the mainstream public. Hard, but that's what we've got to try and do.
Well, we need people in the industry to have the will to tell those stories. And the stories of this pandemic are probably already being written. I heard one theater agent saying in a podcast, in a webinar, that playwrights are avoiding intimate scenes in their writing in anticipation of social distancing lasting much longer than we have now. You are a publisher, Sharmaine, and Isobel, you are an agent. You guys are probably already reading the stuff that we're going to be seeing in print or other media after this pandemic is over. What have you seen so far? What are authors writing and imagining?
Sorry, I just sort of fundamentally disagree with this idea of writing into a space. It's just not something that I can comment on, because it's not something that I understand. I mean, how can you right now, so my husband's a military historian and conflict journalist. And when we had the bookshop in Berlin in sort of 2009, we plotted where were the conflicts around the world, when did they happen, and then how long did it take for the narratives to come. And the reality is that what we're really talking about is 1 million people around the world have died. And those of us who haven't been sort of directly impacted by the pandemic, what are we going to say? We stayed at home, spent time with our family, baked sourdough bread, and got paid. And in between that, people are really struggling. So it's just sort of, it's so outside of anything that I believe in that you could write into this, that I didn't even know.
I don't think I was talking about whether whether people are going to write about this situation. It's just, the pandemic has completely changed their world, and I was wondering whether you were seeing on your submissions a change in the way people are presenting, a change in their stories.
Well, no, because I think that people who have been writing have already been writing so for 3 years. What is different is that when you're reading, you're like, they're touching each other, or they're not wearing masks, or that's really funny that they're all together, but it wasn't that long ago. But so I understand what you're saying, but I just always am I was a scout for a long time, so I track trends very carefully, but I understand them, but it's just not how I think about anything that's going on. It's people are just getting on with what they've done before, if they're lucky to, and that the pandemic hasn't, for those who it hasn't affected, it just really hasn't affected us, and we're just very, very, very lucky.
What about you, Isobel? I mean, I've got some writer friends who have reset their books, that they've been writing for ages. You have to make a decision now as an author. Is it before the pandemic or after the pandemic? There's quite a lot of technical things you've got to think about.
It was a strange scenario in that I think authors who had been imagining this kind of scenario may already have written them. One of my authors, Dion Mayer, wrote a book called Fever about a coronavirus, but he wrote that years ago. And of course, there was a surge of interest in the book again, but there's also a backing off because it's too close to to where people want to be now. So some people go, I want to read more about this, but others are going, let me look at the other fundamental things that make life worth living and reading fantastic. And I don't think that the word a lot of people used about what people were looking for was escapism. And I don't necessarily think that's the right word. I think people read to be absorbed. And sometimes that does take you away from the reality around you, which is one of the reasons why I think the book, the actual beautiful physical book, has done so well as ebooks and audio during this time. But I think there was that moment where people thought everyone's going to be streaming, watching things on screens. But actually, so much of us were spending our time working and are spending our time working on screens, getting our education from screens, that it's actually such a relief and a joy to pick up a book which takes you into your private space and read something absorbing. So although some authors did respond directly on the non-fiction side to the pandemic, where you can write a short proposal, potentially based on research and work you've been doing for some time, and you can write into a space when you're responding in a current affairs way. I agree with Sharmaine that, what I'm always looking to represent are great stories that change minds and lives in different ways.
Thank you. Isobel, you're a poet, right? So has the pandemic moved you to write poetry?
Well, I write all the time in between the little spaces that there are in my working life. I think that, I've probably written a little bit more about nature because I've been tracking the seasons more closely simply by needing to go out and run every single day. And I haven't ever spent every single day in Cambridge for so many months consecutively ever. So I've actually seen something more of the seasons change, which has been really lovely. And I've learned a bit more about certain names of trees and birds that I was pretty rubbish at naming before.
That's lovely. Thank you. Philip Jones, I watched a great webinar that you chaired for the Bookseller about the future of small presses. Maybe Sophia can post the link to the video. Pre-COVID, we relied on small presses to publish the parts of our culture that the big publishers don't reach. Can you hear that? Can you hear the dinosaur? Going again. So pre-COVID, we relied on small presses to publish the parts of our culture that the big publishers don't reach. In a pre-COVID world, they could take risks with outside-the-box themes and outside-the-box authors that big businesses couldn't, which was very good for our culture. Small presses were the ones fighting for diversity long before big publishers woke up to it. But for small presses, the pandemic has been devastating. Does your crystal ball show us a post-pandemic publishing world that leans away from risk towards commercial certainty?
I'm being told to mute myself because apparently I'm the dinosaur. It might be my...
You're the dinosaur.
It might be my laptop fan whirring away in the background. Anyway, I'll just answer this quickly and then I'll mute myself again. Okay. I've been outed. Small presses. Well, when we did a survey in the spring, more than 60% said they feared for their immediate future, and I think even more said they feared for their long-term future. And then I think there was a kind of rallying around them. There was a fund launched that Knights of launched with Jacaranda Press, which raised £150,000 for inclusive publishers in that case. And I think generally there was a recognition, perhaps for the first time, that if they go away, then we really do lose something valuable. Often when you speak to big publishers about small presses, they can be, not Sharmaine hates to add, but they can be a little bit sniffy about them and the role they play, because often they're publishing books that are not commercial in the way that the big publishers would want to publish commercial books. I'd say I slightly disagree with your premise. I think the big publishers do publish lots of tricky and difficult and literary books that often are not commercial too, but I totally agree that small presses do it in a slightly different way and do come at it very differently. So I'm more optimistic now about their future, because I think there is a recognition within the industry that if they go away, we do lose something important and vital. But, it is very dependent on, firstly, bookshops being open, Waterstone surviving, a lot of independents surviving, most of the independents surviving, Blackwell surviving, and also that we get events back very quickly, particularly the bigger festivals, because that stuff is meat and drink to the small presses, where they can really add and use their sort of flexibility to get in there fast, do events and kind of promote authors in a cost-effective way and sell lots of books at those events in a way the bigger publishers tend not to in quite the same way, because they don't need to. I'll mute myself now for a bit.
We really need those vaccines. So the pandemic was also notable for something else. It was the time of the George Floyd uprisings. And it came in the wake of some deeply embarrassing reports about the industry's lack of diversity from Spread the Word and in children's publishing, Book Trust, and the Center for Literacy for Primary Education. Sophia could post the links on the chat box if you're interested in reading those reports. One agent quoted in the author said, at the moment, any writer of color has a premium price. That's because publishing is so ashamed. Now, as a brown person, I have to admit that I am instinctively skeptical of the rush to publish writers of color, because publishers have been ashamed before. Remember the push for multicultural books many, many years ago, before David Cameron decided that multiculturalism was a bad word? Years ago, I appeared on a diversity panel with Tamarind publisher Verna Wilkins. She looked so unhappy. I asked her what was wrong. She said she couldn't believe she was still appearing on a diversity panel after 20 years in the business. Sharmaine, does your crystal ball see real change, or is this another blip? You don't have to be honest.
Do you want to be honest or not?
No, be as honest as you like, honestly. Honestly.
I mean, listen, I think that publishing is a very infantilized business. I think people need to grow up. I think the carpet needs to be shaken. I don't think, we've just seen the report of what's just happened in the civil service today, and how a Black woman who was working on the compensation for the Windrush generation is like, it's institutionally racist. And the reality is that you don't just wake up because someone was murdered in a different country and decide that you're no longer going to be exclusionary. Like, if you were exclusionary in the first place, then, and you've been exclusionary for years and your practice is exclusionary, that will just continue. So you can pay lots of money for people of color to be on various different lists, but the real question will be around retention. And what we've seen in the industry is that the lack of retention of staff from marginalized backgrounds, from Black, Asian, minority, ethnic, LGBTQI+, disability and working class backgrounds is like astounding. It's just like retention is a really big problem. So it's very easy to get stories from different people, because actually there's tons of people writing, because the writing from people from African and Asian backgrounds have been telling stories for thousands of years, and have worked out how to fit into the narrative of European storytelling, which is only a couple of hundred years. So that's like very clear to me. However, we're just not a robust enough industry. And what's really interesting about corporate publishing is that corporate publishing is really new, actually. It's only really kind of like 10, 15, maybe 20 years old, Philip.
You're on the dinosaur back.
Yeah, but I'm just saying, like, corporate publishing isn't that old, it's not that established. It's from big shareholding companies that have bought up other companies that have kind of formed. And so therefore it's like, it's not actually, we're not actually seeing that it necessarily works when so many different types of people are being excluded from it. And especially in London, where, London is 48.2% Black, Asian, marginalized ethnic. And, we're looking at like in the noughts for percentages of people that are actually working in the industry. So I'm just saying that it's interesting that corporate publishing in itself is like a very new structure, and there needs to be a question around whether or not it works. Philip?
Yeah, I mean, it wasn't until the 1980s that the bigger publishers, as were alive back then, kind of combined together. And then since then, it's just been, not quite, I mean, publishing is very slow, so these things happen very slowly. But over time, we've gone from, maybe 10 big publishers, big in an old sense of the word, really, because they weren't global and they weren't corporate. They were much more easy to access, much more easy to talk to. And really in the past few decades, we've gone from having a few of those around to having 5, and possibly now if Simon & Schuster is bought by the Bertelsmann or HarperCollins, we'll have 4. And then you don't have to go very far down until you end up in the sort of Faber and Profile level. So there's a massive gap, a yawning gap, between the really big corporates that Sharmaine works for, Penguin Random House, Hachette, Macmillan, HarperCollins, and everybody else. And everybody else is getting further and further away from the big pack. I would say that I don't entirely dislike corporate publishing, because I think it has the ability to do great good if it chooses to, and perhaps some of the diversity or the sustainability initiatives that are being launched now will be better done because they're done through these massive companies. And back in the 1980s, when I read old copies of the Bookseller, publishing was incredibly posh and exclusive. At the top, very, very dominated by men, to such a degree that I think in the 1970s, the Bookseller decided it would privilege female voices, because it no longer wanted these kind of like very posh white men speaking on behalf of entirety of publishing. So it was a different period, but not necessarily, I would say, a better period. And I totally agree with Sharmaine. It's an untested case. And I think if we end up with another big merger, then those of us who saw the positives in Penguin and Random House merging almost 10 years ago, in that sense that we needed a bigger publisher to out-muscle Amazon, I don't think we're going to see the positives in quite the same way this time around, because big is not necessarily getting better.
I think one of the things that happens in the industry is basically that, it's really also about like this job security thing, and that in the end, it's the corporatization of the arts means that people think more about themselves than like really the art. And I think that's where you see a difference in sort of agents being so independent and so fiercely, for the author. And I think in publishing houses, then, the risk is actually smaller. And wanting to keep your job is sort of greater. And I think that sort of, as someone that's just naturally entrepreneurial, it kind of takes away from the spirit of what we're doing and how we engage with readers and authors. So I would, we've just changed the pillars at Hachette, and I think that thinking more towards, David Shelley is a very entrepreneurial thinker, and I think that shift towards great entrepreneurialism as opposed to like cozy publishing, I think that's where we see a change.
Would you like to comment on that, Isobel?
Yes, I am. There's so many points in what Philip and Sharmaine have both said. I do think the fact of the bigger and bigger the groups get, the fewer players there are, the more risk is that people become complacent, both on the big shareholder and owner level, all the way through the staff base. And we are involved for a long time, all the way through those authors' careers, often 20 years, 30 years. And you now than they used to be, but things are still moving slowly right across the industry. Agents too, we're really looking at how we, because books matter, stories matter, and what we publish and agent.
When the lockdown began, I have to admit, heaving a huge sigh of relief when I learned that Amazon delivery people were considered essential workers. Can the chain, or does your crystal ball tell you that we will all go back to normal, to the way we were very soon?
Do you mean that we'll go back to normal in terms of book buying? Sorry, I'm not quite sure which bit of normal you mean.
Well, I think a lot of authors are thinking, well, maybe I could do some self-publishing now. Booksellers are changing the way they sell books. We're not getting discovered in the same way because there are no physical bookshops. And so everyone is it's kind of creative in a certain way. It's quite a challenge, but things are changing. And but this pandemic is temporary, hopefully. When we come out, are we going to be back in the same place, or will things change irretrievably?
I don't think we're going to be back in the same place. I hope we won't be back in the same place. I hope we'll have moved forward in many ways. I do think there's always been a space for self-publishing. There's always going to be writers who don't have the book at that moment that finds an agent or a publisher. And I've taken on and sold a book that was self-published that went straight into the top Sunday Times top 10 by a writer who wrote it in his 70s. So there is, of course, always room for people to try different things. And but it's not easy. It's not easy. It's easy to get a book printed, but it's not that easy to keep selling it. And I think so many moving parts applies even to the creation of a book. How many aspects of expertise need to go into a book, from the editing, the copy editing, the proofreading, the cover, the metadata, the various places it has to be sold, and you have to keep working on that all the time, which is why having an agent and a publisher, as well as really good bookstores, and we really have to speak out for all the bookstores, the tiny indie, that you've got a good page on Amazon, and making sure you've got a good website. You don't necessarily have to be on social media, but you have to create your own window, even if you have an agent and a publisher. There's so much that you have to do to keep.
We can't just be artists sitting in our gallery.
I totally agree with that. I mean, I've seen some people on the chat kind of commenting of like, oh, it's because I didn't have a social media account. And it's like, okay, let's just, what? Like, I mean, it's, okay, so you're asking people to take at least 8 to 10 hours out of their time in their life to read your story, your narrative, your research, which, yes, you've probably done for a very long time, and it only takes them 8 to 10 hours to your, like, say, 3 to 5 years. But then you just want them to kind of not engage with you at all. You're like, I wrote my book, I said what I had to say, and I'm done. And I'm just like, in all worlds, that's crazy. It's like we give so much of ourselves as your agent, as your publicist, the bookseller, like your trade magazine. We give so much of ourselves to engage with a book. And so as a writer, the idea that you've kind of written it and you've done your job, and that you're not going to engage with people who are going to read, but yet you want thousands of them to read it, and that they're not supposed to do anything else. They're not supposed to be on their phones, watch television, etc., and you just watch the royalty checks come in. I just like, this is wild, and I have authors that are not on social media and they've sold really, really well, but they've engaged in other ways, and they've done interviews and they've been on panels, and I think it's all part of giving yourself towards the art that you're creating. And you see it with lots of different art forms, whether it's actors, whether it's filmmakers, it's people want to, if people have spent time in your world, then I think that you can give back. And to not, I just think is like just unbelievable, and really just the most privileged thing I can imagine.
Right. Well, we Philip mentioned Amazon earlier, and we can't not mention Amazon, the big winner of this pandemic. Amazon, Philip, a future book. You were speaking to Charlie Redmayne of HarperCollins. He said the shift to online shopping was seismic and has fueled the acquisition of big brand authors with platforms that work well with Amazon. It feels like the bigger Amazon gets, the smaller the cultural world is destined to shrink. Sometimes it feels like there's no turning back. Philip, is there no turning back?
I just want to go back to something Sharmaine said, because I remember back in the day when we only really had bookshops through which to sell books. I remember it was always the most hardworking authors, so like a Terry Pratchett, who would go on a massive bookshop tour, who really supported the people who were selling his books, who were often the most successful. So I don't think it's new that we ask authors to do more work beyond just writing the books. I think that's always been the case. Is there any going back with Amazon? No, not really. But I think Amazon will shift its priorities. It's less adventurous in the book space at the moment, I think, than it has ever been. And I'm not sure that the cultural thing is an Amazon problem necessarily, because obviously, with it's a screen problem, isn't it? So you can't see. I go into a bookshop, you can see 2,000 different lines. You can walk in. I walked into a bookshop the other day when they were open, and I picked up a book, a Kurt Vonnegut book on his speeches, published by a publisher I'd never even heard of. And that's quite unusual for me to pick up a book by a publisher I've not heard of, for obvious reasons. Now, I would never have got to that book if I'd been on Amazon, and almost without doubt. But that's not, it's the same. Netflix has exactly the same problem. We all drift towards the same thing that we've watched before, or a variation of the same thing. It's really hard to break out in an online environment. I think bookshop.org is offering us a different window on that screen, in the sense that it is built around Bookseller and other people's recommendations, and not the algorithm, which I think is really important and good. And I also like to point out, because it is in the chat room, many authors do self-publish, and Amazon has massively democratized publishing. It's taken away all, should you choose to as an author, it's taken away all the gatekeepers. You can write your book and you can publish direct to Kindle direct publishing, and you can reach a massive audience if you are good at marketing your book and pricing your book and doing all those things that make it work in that environment. And I think that's a massive, as well as everything that Amazon does that we worry about, that is a massive cultural shift in the way we think about publishing and book selling that Amazon has led on. And I think that's there's lots of things in the negative corner. I think that's one massive thing in the positive corner, because I think that's been really beneficial to lots of authors who otherwise have been ignored by publishers, big and small. Is there any going back? I think it will take regulation, and I think it will be Amazon taking its eye off the ball for things to go back. And usually over time, we all remember when Microsoft was the biggest company in the world, or thereabouts, and its dominance seemed impossible to imagine that it would never be that dominant. I think the same thing will happen with Amazon over time. Other players will come through. In the audio space, we already see players like Storytel, I think, challenging Audible, and I think we'll see in the end something similar in online retail and in the ebook market, as long as the regulators can prevent Amazon pulling up the ladder, which it clearly has done with Kindle.
It's gonna be interesting. We've got a question that was sent to us. I'll read it to you. It's quite long. This is from Elizabeth Harding. In many newspapers recently, an editorial tendency towards bandwagon jumping and the encouraging of herd-like attitude has resulted in the pursuit of issues and enslavish issues in quotes, and enslavish obedience towards following government policy regarding COVID-19. Whether we are political supporters of Sir Neil Allott Starkadder or Boris Butt Trinket, surely we as writers should always keep a sharp critical mind, disregarding the hysteria, allowing the bandwagons to pass and the party policies to flourish, then fade. In spite of an aggressive, almost religious pressure to conform, shouldn't we be intellectually honest and critical, opting always for the freedom to think? Maybe Alan can answer that.
Freedom to think, absolutely. I think freedom is what we're here for, and that's what most probably that has kept us going in lots of ways through this year and through lots of difficult times in the past. I think the thing is that there's always been some people who are followers and accept. And I just think that, if anything, what we have to learn is to be a little bit more independent of mainstream popular culture. And I think that it is difficult. It's interesting in such a polarized society as we have today. You know, we just have to look at America and as a perfect example of that. But every country in the world has this kind of issue. We are becoming more tribal, you know, hence the culture, particularly in books, of genre. You know, you can become a Kindle millionaire overnight, or not overnight, but quite quickly if you write, you know, if you're successful within your genre. Genre is basically, you can live within it. When I was a kid, it was the punks, the soul kid, or that those small presses, those people are producing books on a much smaller line, can be successful in a way that they weren't years ago. Independent DIY book creating is becoming up and down the country and beyond beyond this country to many other countries is phenomenal. The kind of fascination with the printed word and the production of a book, a real book that people are doing, and it could be small numbers of 10, 50, 100 editions to slightly bigger ones. You know, at the end of the day, you know, I'm thinking, you know, Beatrix Potter, Peter Rabbit, that was a self-published book, got picked up. Look at that. You know, there's always been that. There'll always be, and there'll always be people who want to be discovered and will be produced, you know, in a sort of self-published way. And I think that I'd like to think that, in a way, there will always be a democratization. And my critique has always been, and I certainly think the series I'm working on at the moment, Don't Log Off, is to be able to put voices of people from different countries, different backgrounds together. And all of a sudden, you actually have a democratization of voice just by hearing voices from different people and different backgrounds. And I think that it is really important that we have a chance to be able to listen out for those voices. And I think, you know, I don't know where it starts. And I think one of the big questions you have is that, particularly when it's very, very hard. It's very hard for someone who, and I've met so many people, I'm sure you all have, who've written something. How do I get this heard? And how do I get it seen? And I just think, well, the most important thing is that they've tried to do it. And it's up to people, for us, who are in the business of being a conduit for those voices, to make it our duty to be able to present those voices. So I think that is it. If we all are in our own ways conduits for storytelling, and that is our role, and we should be able to do our best and utmost, and particularly learning from what has happened this year, to make it even more of a reason to go about doing it.
Thanks, Alan. We've got another question here from John Hans. This is a question about which type of book and author have suffered the most. I gained the clear impression that publishers were only accepting brand name authors. Fair enough. Or those with huge social media followers, irrespective of quality of book. Not so good. From my experience, those who spend nearly all of their time on social media to gain their following write poorly or little and use ghostwriters. Any comments?
Yeah, I mean, like, sure. I mean, like, sure, if that's, I mean, you can tell yourself that. I'm really amazing, and all these people that have got loads of followers are actually really terrible. But, you know, whatever. I mean, it's just not how it works. I've got a book that came in as Rainbow Milk by Paul Mendes, that came in as a biography, and I asked him to rewrite it as a narrative fiction, and we published it on the 23rd of April in the midst of a lockdown, and it's an obscure literary novel about a young black man who is from the West Midlands, who is a Jehovah's Witness, who gets excommunicated from the church for being gay, he's disfellowed, moves to London and becomes a sex worker. And it's like super literary and has sold thousands of copies, despite the fact that no bookshops were open and and he's not on social media. And I'm just like,
So how did you do it? How did you do it?
Because it was just really, really great and everyone really wanted to read it. Do you know what I mean? It's like at some point, of course, you can be like, publishing's really terrible, everyone's really terrible, you know, they don't pay attention, you know, and at some point, like, not everything goes through, not everything that deserves to be seen is seen. But you know what? That's what it is. And this idea of like polarizing it, like, well, they're on social media, so that's why they got a book deal. It's like, it's not true. You see what you want to see, but the most important thing, as far as I'm concerned, is that you write what you want to write. And you just make sure it's the best. And then you make sure that you publish it with people that actually understand what it is that you're doing and the direction. And before that, you find the right agent. And it doesn't always work. And there's so many books that we love and are really passionate about and think this is going to do it. And it doesn't. But that's part of art. And to kind of try and find the formula to everything is just, I don't know, I just really disagree with this kind of attitude. And I think it's really trite and really, I just have no interest in it, because it's like, it's everyone else and not me. And I'm like, what did you do? And did you write the best book? Did you, John? I don't know.
Publishing never behaves as you expect it to, and if it did, we'd be very bored of it very quickly. I was about to say that the worst bit of the business of being now would be a hardback literary author being published by one of the smaller imprints during lockdown, and a debut author. But Sharmaine has just proved me absolutely wrong, because she's shown that actually you can work, and you can be that author, and you can sell thousands of copies. And it just goes to show that whatever you say, whatever you hear from pundits like me, or even publishers like Sharmaine, or agents like Isobel, something unexpected can still happen to you and to your book. And you know, without getting sentimental, that is the dream. That is the reason we're all doing this. If it made sense, it wouldn't be interesting.
Yeah, and actually, just to say on that, like every day, you know, when we're in the office or with my colleagues, because I've only been I've been in the industry for a long time, but I've been a publisher for only 3 years. And whenever we talk about this as a business, you know, the adage is like, if I knew how to do it, that's all we would do. If we knew how to make it work, that's all we do. But all we can do is try. And ultimately, you know, we've got to look at readers, and we've got to respect readers / consumers more. And, you know, we've got to be better at reaching people. And, you know, in no other time than basically everything being closed has kind of shown us that we need a mirror up to ourselves to think about what we're doing and why we're doing it and how it all works. And not everybody that creates art in this world will be seen. And that's a real shame. That's a real shame. Or is it? I don't know.
Isobel, what advice do you give your authors who feel like that? Like everybody else is doing, you know, social media and despising the you know, that kind of...
I have writers who are very active on social media and those who are not on social media at all. The most important thing remains the writing. It's always about the writing and the quality of the writing. And I'm all about the long game. I'm all about, don't rush this book. You know, if you only have one chance at a debut book, you only have one chance to write the memoir of your life. You know, don't go, oh, it's this trend, it's this moment, I must get it out, and I'm going to, like, if I don't Instagram all the time, no one's going to pay attention. In fact, you can also have the opposite effect. You can tweet too much, certainly too much about yourself. Only go on social media if you want to treat it like a conversation with the world, and if you're interested in other people, and use that to feed your creativity. But if it becomes a terrible chore, then don't do it. It must be part of a creative life. And I agree with what Sharmaine says. It's one of the arts. And, you know, I'm a poet. Certainly not everything I've ever offered to publishers has been accepted. You send poems out and they come back rejected all the time, and you turn them around and you send them out again. So my other thing is to all my clients, it's the long game and it's perseverance. Write well, believe in yourself, but take the critique that is needed when it's needed and persevere.
Thank you. Well, I think that's a great place to end and go off and have our glasses of wine. Alan, Isobel, Philip, Sharmaine, thank you for your thoughtfulness, your wisdom, and your optimism. Thank you to Sophia Jackson, who worked that chat box really hard while we were getting on with the talk. Thank you for everyone for taking the time to attend yet another Zoom meeting. Sorry about the dinosaur, and sorry that some of you had slow bandwidth. I'm sorry about that. I think Webinar Jam takes a lot more bandwidth than Zoom, so that happens. But you can watch the video later. Our next SOA at Home session is Making a Will. We all need wills. It takes place this coming Monday at 2 p.m. with our Chief Executive, Nicholas Solomon, and Solicitor, Robert Craig. Our next afternoon tea is on the 26th of November with Margaret Atwood, and is in conjunction with the Writers Union of Canada. So if you want to go to book your place, you head to the Society of Authors website. Please post the link, my little darlings, on the chat box. Recordings from this festival will be available on Vimeo, and the link will be put up as well. Final thanks. Let's continue this conversation on Twitter, maybe, although I'm not going to be there because I'm really looking forward to my white wine. Thank you, everyone. We're going to leave this open for a little bit so you can chat. And, you know, there was a lot of great stuff about exchanging information about self-publishing. And I hope the SOA people can share that that information somewhere. Okay. Thank you, everyone. You can log off by clicking.
Thank you, Candy.
Thank you. To turn your thing off, you click on the thing that looks like Thomas the Tank Engine on the top left-hand corner.
Thanks.
Bye-bye. So nice to meet you guys. Bye.
Thank you.